So let me welcome you to our event and introduce folks. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Carson Holloway, the chairman of the Political Science Department. And I want to welcome you to our panel on the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Views from Europe and the United States. I do want to mention that this event is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science, as well as the Goldstein Center for Human Rights and NSITE, that is the National Counterterrorism Technology and Education Center here at UNO. Let me begin by introducing our panelists, and then we'll hear a bit from them on the situation in Ukraine. I've said we're having views from Europe and the United States. I think it's fair to say that our guests from Poland will give us the European view, and our own UNO faculty will give us the American view, but maybe also just their own personal views and professional views of this important question. So let me introduce our speakers to begin with, and then I'll turn it over to them. From the other end of the table, that is from your left, we have Dr. Rafał Kopeć from the Institute of Security Studies at Pedagogical University in Krakow, Poland. And next to him, Dr. Przemysław Mazur. He's laughing because of my pronunciation. He may want to introduce himself after that, also from the Institute of Security Studies at the Pedagogical University, Krakow, Poland. And then we have Dr. Michelle Black of the Political Science Department and also of NSITE, and Dr. Jody Neathery-Castro of the Political Science Department and the School of Music this year as interim director. So let's thank our panelists in advance, and then we'll turn it over to them. Oh, why don't you start and we'll work our way down the panel.
Oh, it's difficult to say something that could be kind of general overview of this conflict, and that could be not obvious, but I would like to mention, to highlight two threats. One about rationality, and the second about mentality. And when it comes to rationality, I rather oppose to perceiving Vladimir Putin and Russian leadership and Russian military and political establishment as a bunch of madmen and irrational people. And when we see gains and goals and targets of Russia, we see that they are quite rational, because what is this war all about? I think it's not the war about territory. However, territory is a factor of huge importance in Russian common consciousness and common imaginary, and I think it's not a war about population. And despite of the fact that joining millions of Ukrainian people to Russia could be beneficial for them, and maybe it's not the war about culture. However, the culture is a factor highlighted and estimated by Russian propaganda. I think it's the war about power status, about perceiving. We can call it in a different ways, like this is a war about being a subject and not an object of international relation, about being of one of the three main centers of powers of international order, except Washington and Beijing. And I think that these targets are quite rational, and of course, moreover, the moment of breaking this war is not, I think, is not accidental, because there is a kind of window of opportunity to Russian politicians because of the situation in Western countries, United States perceiving the American president as weak, as unstable because of age, and perceiving by Russian, of course, perceiving Germany, new German government as unexperienced and having kind of positive attitude towards Russia, because the main party of this government is Social Democratic Party, and perceiving President of France as election, and moreover, I think that to Russian leadership, it could be kind of thinking in terms of now or never, because Russia is weaker and weaker due to population changes and due to moving away from using fossil fuels in Western countries. And I think because of these factors, the goals of Russia could be perceived as rational, and we know the ends, but we have a problem with means, because we have no enough knowledge about cost-benefit ratio, about acceptable risk, what Russian leaderships are willing to sacrifice to achieve these goals. And in this situation, it could be like struggling with Russia is like struggling with nature. There is a situation in game theory, fighting with nature, like what can we do facing the threat of volcano tending to explode. You can do almost anything. You can't deter it. You can't giving it a bribe. You can use any means of coercive diplomacy. It is the same situation like in Russia, and we can only prepare and react. And I think we have to be more proactive, not only reactive, maybe even a little bit escalatory. But we have to gain more knowledge about this kind of Russian rationality. And the second thing, mentality, I have a passion about this factor on Monday during classes, and I think there's a kind of clash between Western way of warfare and Eastern way of warfare, and what are the roots of them. I think the main factor is value ladder. In the Western societies, there is a primacy of individuals over the community, and but in Eastern societies, the goals, the desires, the interests of community, of country, of authorities have always been more important than goals, desires, interests of the every individual. And how does it translate into the waging of war? I think in two ways. The first thing is we can observe kind of attitude, disregarding attitude toward own losses in Russian military, and according to some reports, the ratio of survivability of wounded soldiers in Ukraine forces is about 70%, and in Russian military system about 30%, which is a huge discrepancy. And it is, of course, about diminishing the ability to waging war, and it's about how can we fight? We can fight in a more brave way when we know that in case of being wounded, the evacuation system is quite efficient. And the second factor, I think, is more important, is about so-called network-centric warfare, and it's not about only acquiring and using advanced weaponry. Of course, it's very important, but it's about decentralization, de-hierarchization to some extent, of course. It is about leaving the freedom of decision making to the middle and low level of military system. Is about commanding by goals, not by giving the detailed orders. And we can observe this in case of Ukrainian military system, and not in Russian armed forces. And I think it's impossible to impose this kind of fighting to the society, to the army, which is kind of post-feudal, like Russian society and Russian army. And I think it's the factor of huge importance, and could be to some extent a little bit striking that Ukrainians are so different than Russians in this field. And maybe the last issue about mentality, I think this is not the coincidence that in Russian language we have the whole bunch of words meaning mess, disorder. When we see the dictionary, there's about 20 words meaning this factor, like bardak, like musor, and there's a beautiful Russian word rozgildiajstwo, kind of state of affairs. Strange mixture of irresponsibility, indifference, laziness, stupidity, of course. And when some level of this factor is exceeded, for example, planes are falling, nuclear submarines are drawing, nuclear power plants are exploding, and we can observe this factor of when we see how Russian military system operates. And I hope that is an open question to what extent and how far and how quickly the Russian military system to be able to learn the lessons from the first phase of operation. I hope that not too quickly and not too far.
Okay, thank you. First of all, we are very glad that you had us here. This is great to talk with you, to show you our point of view, especially because Central Europe is very complicated. It's some kind of microcosmos. If you are not born there, you probably never understand this mess. This is very little part of Europe, little part of the world, many nations, languages, and very complicated history. Rafał showed here many issues about this, but I want to mark especially these cultural problems, why Ukrainians are fighting. Because maybe this is interesting for you. This was in fact one state for many years. You can say they won the same nation, but not ethnic way. Why they do it? Why they are dying? Why they are fighting? And if we were expected of this, 2 days before the full-scale aggression, because you have to know that this war not started in this year. This was 2014. Of course, this is different stage, much more harder, but this war is still going on for a few years. And let me tell you something. I was talking with my chairman of our institute, Professor Olga Vasiuta. She's Ukrainian. And I asked her, this is only about Donetsk and Lugansk. She said, yes, only about this. Probably this will be the next slide, because we sometimes call that this salami tactic. That means salami is too big to eat at once. Then you can slide by slide, and after all, you eat all. And Ukraine is like this salami. It's too big, too strong to Russia to take it very quickly. That's why they Donetsk, a little bit of Lugansk, and now probably we thought that probably they will take the rest of Donetsk and the rest of the Lugansk. I was surprised a little bit. Why a little bit? Because we saw that Putin is ready for the whole-scale war, but this is maybe some kind of wish thinking that maybe this is the next plan. Maybe he will resign. Maybe Macron something will do with Putin. He was too weak. In fact, Putin was lying to Macron, directly looking his eyes directly. That means Macron was there. That directly Putin's Kremlin. That's why, like Rafał said, it was the right time, the last time for Putin to make this war. I was cooperating with some Ukrainian officers for some NATO project, and I saw that like Ukrainian army is changing. This is completely different army than 2014. 2014 for Ukrainian soldiers, they were not sure that they have to fight. Some of Ukrainian soldiers said, "Oh no, in Russian army there is better salary." For me, it doesn't matter, Ukrainian flag or Russians. In Crimea, there was very many these cases that soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, were surrounded and go to serve to the Russian army. Now it's impossible. Now Ukrainians feel that this is their state, their army, their honor. In the case of honor for Ukraine, student, PhD student, she's from Kiev. Her name is Anna. And I said to her, don't be bad on me. But in my opinion, there was no Ukrainian nation, in fact, between 2014 and she's Ukrainian. She said, yes, you have right. Now, after this so-called Euromaidan or Maidan of now we are starting to build this nation, and we feel that we are one nation. Even somebody speaking Russian or Ukrainian. And Putin, in fact, achieved goals for Ukrainians, not for him. He is responsible for building Ukrainian nation. He don't believe that Ukrainian nation is existing. Probably you heard his speech that he was talking that there is no Ukrainian nation, this is some kind of fake. Medvedev said the same. This is a fake news that there is Ukrainian nation. If this is fake, with who they are fighting? This is the question. And this time was the better time for Putin because, like Rafał said, the state is each year is weaker. For example, Russia 10 years ago, it was about 7th economy in the world. Now it's 11. Now, war. Now it's the worst. Putin is older. The factor that we have to take as well. There's many ideas that maybe he's sick, maybe cancer, maybe something. I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. But he knows that Ukrainian army is stronger and stronger because of cooperation with NATO. So Ukrainian soldiers are fighting in a completely different way. We see this, for example, in air battles, because fighters, because the pilots, Ukrainian pilots, are fighting in a different NATO way, not in Russian way. That's why they're still fighting. It's impossible. It's 65 days, if I can do it, and they still have aircraft with Great Russia. This is something that nobody can expect. And Putin knows that this is the right time, and the second thing, General said, he was sure that the West is very divided. It's not one West. France, Germany, Great Britain after Brexit, everyone is playing own role. And he was surprised, I think. He was surprised, maybe not about Biden. He could expect this, especially Blinken is a very strong person in the White House. We enjoyed the fact because, like I said at the beginning, Central Europe, you have to feel, but you cannot teach. He's learns. He's Hungarian. Like it used to be in the White House, Madeleine Albright from Czech, Zbigniew Brzeziński from Poland, yes. That's why we are now happy that Blinken is in the White House, and probably he feels what's going on in this part of Europe. That's why probably Putin was expected that Biden would be angry on him, but he was pretty sure that Germans, especially Germans and French, will give him green light, like usual. And he is surprised, in my opinion. He, in fact, joined the West. We thought it's impossible. Unfortunately, Poland is playing a better role in this West part of our in the West because our government is against Brussels. It's very complicated.
Not part that our government.
Our government, yes. Because Polish society is generally okay with the European Union. Our government has some problems with Brussels. In fact, our government was playing for Putin with Viktor Orban. In fact, it's very pity. With Marine Le Pen, with Salvini from Italy. These guys. That's why now we have the West joined alliance like never, and we are very happy because of it. Putin is surprised. He wanted to NATO go back to the borders since before 1997, 1999, and what we got, probably Finland and Sweden in NATO, Ukrainians who hates Russia. Now, the Ruski Mir project, for some of them, was interesting. Now they don't believe in Ruski Mir. They saw what it means, in fact, Ruski Mir. Ruski Mir, this is not Chaikov. This is not Tolstoy. Ruski Mir is Bucha, like you maybe saw in television. This is Ruski. And many part of Ukraine was happy because of Russia. They want to be part of Russia in some way. For example, Mariupol. Mariupol was 100% Russian-speaking people. If you made some polls 20 years ago, do you want to be part of Ukraine or Russia? Probably they will be enjoyed to join Russia. Now Mariupol is dead. But it does not exist. And for sure, those people are not interested, even they speak Russian, to be a part of Ruski Mir. And this is the next goal that Putin not take, and his action is in fact against himself. Maybe let's think about culture, because I said why Ukrainians are fighting. In my opinion, this is some kind of soft power of West. After 2014, to Poland arrived about 1 million Ukrainians. They live with us in Poland. I have, like I said, students from Ukraine, my children is from Ukraine, and they saw that we can live in another way. Comfortable, security, safety. We can go to the work, our kids can play on the playground, go to the school. I have some good work. This is West, and they believed in this West. And they decided, no, we are not interested in this Russian problem. Their families in Ukraine saw how West looks like in reality, not in Russian propaganda television. That's why probably when they have this choice, Ruski Mir or West, I know we are fighting, but not interested in the Ruski Mir, we're interested in the West way of life. This is changing completely their mentality. Of course, Ukrainians have a little different history than the Russian. The person was, as human being, was important for Ukrainians, for Russian completely not. For Russian Tsar is the guy next to the God, and state, not people. When you saw some maybe movies from this war, for example, in the US Army, you had this snowman behind. So what they are Russian doing with their soldiers? They are killing them, and after this, by tanks, they destroy their bodies. This is Russian Ruski Mir.
So I'm going to build off of what my fellow panelists have mentioned when it comes to the rationality as well as the culture. So we've witnessed 2 months of this invasion into Ukraine, and there's a lot of questions that are being presented around the news, and that's really the questions of why. Why would Russia invade? Why were they not deterred from invading Ukraine? And where do we go from here? So I'm going to attempt to answer these specific questions as a former DoD deterrence analyst and a political scientist academic, not from an expert on Ukraine, Russia, or even the areas like my fellow panelists here. So different perspective. First, why hosted panels already answering this question. And there are a lot of answers going around explaining that Russia has a deep concern with the Ukraine, that they share share history, culture, religion, and language, just as my fellow panelists have alluded to. And Russia was not pleased in the way that Ukraine was going in the direction, specifically the political arena. So for years, Russia was comfortable leading Ukraine down this path that they were carving out. However, as we were seeing and just explained before, Ukraine started charting their own path, which made Russia nervous about their pursuits in becoming closer, specifically to NATO and becoming a NATO member. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about. So we hear sometimes that NATO is not necessarily a big deal for Russia in terms of Ukraine becoming part of Russia. But I would like to actually contend that and express that I think that was a major part of this invasion. NATO is a collective defense organization that has focused on deterring Russia since its inception. And if Ukraine were to join this collective defense, NATO would be on Russian borders. Now, again, they're already members there, but this would even be a closer event. This would be fueling Russia's fear of encroachment, and that is something that Russia would not like. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the decision points, at least that I think, is that they were not a NATO country, meaning Ukraine was not a NATO country. And the NATO and US stated before the invasion, and you can read this on White House transcripts as well as NATO transcripts, that they said there is no intention to send US or NATO troops to Ukraine. That was very blatantly said right before the invasion, just a few days. So this was a clear message to Putin. If you invade, we will not respond with ground forces. And that's what Putin was doing. As my panelists said before, this invasion was not new. It started before. So this was now the next iteration. This was ground forces. And that's where we see this invasion, clear message, and the narrative. Now, this rolls me into the next question. Why were they not deterred? Why did they not fear that NATO maybe would have came over or other countries to protect Ukraine? So this term deterrence is simply the form of the process of preventing an action from happening. So when we say, why was Russia not deterred from attacking Ukraine? This means, why did Russia not see any costs associated with them going into Ukraine? Did they not think that they would experience blowback from invading this country from NATO, US, UN? So only Putin knows Putin, and he knows what he knows. But what we can do to understand is, one, they're viewing Ukraine as a threat if they join NATO. Two, they got the all clear from organizations that if they were due to do this conventionally, they would not be met with other forces from different countries and organizations. And three, they did it before with Crimea with little blowback or costs associated. So why not now? And I really appreciate my panelists' comments about earlier before with the Crimea and how the decision process of that. So these thoughts we can rationalize and we can ask ourselves, what is Putin thinking? So there's been a lot in the news about Putin miscalculating Ukraine response, and I would have to agree with this. Additionally, there has been a collective response by NATO. I agree with my panelists that we have seen NATO come together where Putin, and it's been publicized and published, that he wants to break up NATO. One of his main goals is to make sure NATO does not exist, but he miscalculated the defense that happened in this small geographical area in Europe. So now we're seeing this collective defense, but unfortunately, why Russia has invaded and why they were not deterred is pretty point. It's not an easy answer. In fact, it's pretty difficult because all the paths lead to consequences of an outcome. So I have a couple questions to ask and I'll answer them. So I like this part. So does NATO truly get involved beyond just single countries delivering or providing weapons or financial support and delivery? Now, if they were to get involved, this would change the balance of the conflict from a regional 3-state fight, because we're forgetting Belarus is involved here. It's just not a Russia-Ukraine fight. There are other countries involved. But if NATO were to get involved, this would change the dynamic to a larger regional, but also a global fight. Next question. Does Russia and its supporting allies continue to fight conventionally until they win? because we know that's really what Putin wants to do. He wants to walk away feeling he's won here. But if they don't see gains, could we see something additional in conventional fighting, or could we see tactical nuclear weapons come out? And again, this would bring on a whole different level of conflict if that were to happen. But it's still a possibility. Next question, does Ukraine stop fighting? And that's really interesting to hear your perspective about the Ukraine's point of view now during this fight. It's something that I haven't really been exposed to. So I appreciate your comments here. Knowing that maybe they didn't think of themselves as Ukrainians, but now they do. And I think that brings a different dynamic to this conversation. And then lastly, is there a ceasefire? Could we see a country divided where Putin may be happy with certain sections, but that still brings in its own challenges, because you're going to see insurgencies, you're going to see internal fighting, because now you're separating a country that was a sovereign country. So where do we go from here? Well, we don't go back. We can't go back. There's no way we go to where it was before. Status quo does not exist anymore in this situation. In fact, the conflict, because of the power balance and involvement, will change in how we operate in spaces now and in the future, diplomatically, economically, and conventionally. And one thing we've learned is that globalization has created dependencies. This is clear. And we saw this in a news article this morning about the EU claiming Russia is blackmailing them on the oil and gas reserves because they're shutting off the pipeline to the EU because Russia wants them to pay them in ruble. Well, why is that? Because that's the only currency that Russia can operate in due to the sanctions placed on, due to the conflict. So again, there are these consequences and things that we're learning. So I will end in saying that where we go from here needs to have a lot of thought behind it, especially depending on who's asking the question. Is this the UN? Where do we go from here? Is this NATO? The US, Ukraine, Russia, other countries in the region. It all depends on the perspective you're talking about, because all of these actors have their own interests to consider on a conflict that usually we boil down to two sides, but there are many sides to consider here. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Boy, my panelists have covered a lot of ground. I'll just maybe say just a couple of comments. I mean, I appreciate too the way that, the direction of this conversation has gone, because you've hit on a lot of the points that I was hoping we would get to. I think it's important for most of you students, this may be the first time you've been paying attention to a, sort of a conflict of this type. And so I think, it's kind of scary, and it's also uncertain as to, kind of what to expect. And, one of the things that I was just talking with former Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, alum of UNO. And one of the questions that I had was, where do you think this is going to go? Where do you think this will end? And I, was really interested in his perspective as, head of the U.S. Defense Department at one time, and certainly a keen watcher. And he deferred a little bit on this, but I think one of the things that my panelists have emphasized, and I would reemphasize, is that this hasn't gone how Russia planned it. And if they had succeeded in sort of their quick, decisive victory, they would have probably ended the sovereignty of Ukraine. But they have faced all these setbacks, and they have overreached. And just like my panelists all emphasized, this has actually had some interesting unintended consequences that strengthen the West, the strengthening of Ukrainian nationalism and collective spirit, the joining together of European nationalism, and really this Atlantic connection binding the U.S. and the West together. It's really been such a stark, clear divide for those of us watching from the West, that you have, good versus evil, and it's it's drawn those lines pretty clearly. That message is not what they're hearing inside of Russia. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. So we haven't talked at all about sort of how the control of media and disinformation can play into the willingness to fight and even the willingness of people within the societies to accept kind of the hardships that go along with being a nation at war. It probably could end in 3 different ways. We could see more Russian success in the near term. They haven't fought in the way that they haven't adhered to any of the international norms of conflict by attacking civilians and by disallowing humanitarian exit, by engaging in war crimes. This is desperation, right? But they could gain some in this stage of conflict. They could make it difficult for Ukrainian sovereignty to exist going forward. The signs so far have not gone that direction, and so that's a positive thing. And I would mention too that you mentioned the difference in the Ukrainian fighting now versus back 2014. The United States has been training the Ukrainians in addition to the weapons support that's come from the United States and other allies. And that was a point that Secretary of Defense Hagel made in talking about the investment that the United States has put into trying to assist the Ukrainians and really the U.S. leadership role that he thinks is also necessary and moral in this conflict. We could see a stalemate. We could see things that maybe end more or less where they were before the invasion, with Russia maintaining control of Crimea and exercising control through proxies in the Donbass region. And that would be if you saw, sort of Russian clawing back some success with the kind of, terrible tactics that they're using in trying to break the spirit and attack civilians. They could get to a point where the Ukrainians would potentially be willing to accept such a price. But it would, that would not be a great outcome for the Ukrainians. And then, we could see the Ukrainians continue to have some of the military success of the type that we have seen. And, where would that put Russia? This is one of the things that I think a lot of observers are trying to understand is just at what point, what is Russia willing to accept to end this? And it's really important, I think, for all the powers involved to think about, what are the goals that they want to see, and how will they be able to sort of bring this to a close? I don't think this is going to end soon. Unfortunately, I think we're in for the protracted stage of this. It is important to note that one of the things that Secretary Hagel also mentioned is the importance that, however this ends, we need U.S. leadership in drawing to a close. We will have to hold Russia accountable for what it has done, and we have to. And one important reason of that is because other states are watching, and you alluded to some of the other authoritarian leaders. I mean, China is watching, Iran is watching. We cannot allow, hopefully, this whole, you raised the question about nuclear weapons. And, one of the reasons why it's important for this kind of accountability is because of the nuclear power that Russia has, and other nuclear powers are watching this and looking to see how what are the opportunities that things like tactical nuclear weapons would be usable. So the fact that we have these other states watching us, And then just this last point about US support to President Zelensky and Ukrainians. The United States has taken risk in this. I mean, and you've seen a real careful deliberation on, wanting to very clearly signal, the on the part of NATO towards Russia, in the sense of giving that fuel to Putin to say, well, we've engaged these other powers in NATO, and therefore the clause 5 to kick in for NATO powers to have to, like accidental attack on Poland or the like, and making that clear. But yeah, I guess I don't have a great answer, and neither did Secretary of Defense Hagel, in thinking that we can predict how this will end. Political scientists, we don't like to predict things. We like to post-dict them after they've already happened and explain them. And so we're always careful not to get too much into the prediction business. But yeah, misdiagnosis on the part of Russia is really important, and it's really changed the course of what we're seeing unfold. So I'll stop there because I know you might have a couple questions, or students may have questions.
It's a great panel, very enlightening. We do have time for questions. Is there a question from, we have a question here.
Hi, name's David Rudichka, and I actually kind of have a one would be how Russia is calculated. Where do you think that is possible with how Russian dynamics towards the West with certain actions, with political means and hacking into infrastructure of countries in the West, from the United States to Europe in general, and even trying to play into like what Putin saw, not as, along with the fact that for a certain period of time, he got a leader from the US that has, like in recent history, has been opposed to Russia as a country, but by getting in a person that is more like, I don't want to say like pro Putin, but more friendly to Putin. Did that play a role during those years of what led to this conflict? And like, it did, how much of a role?
Maybe want to kind of summarize the question.
Yeah. So I think, the question has to do with how did Russian meddling in cyberspace contribute to what we're seeing today? Would you say that that's a fair summary?
I would say that's a very super condensed summary.
Well, I just because I want to make sure we clarify that we're not saying that Russia puts a president into U.S. politics. Is that what you're saying?
With how there was meddling in not just the U.S. elections, but how they tried to meddle with so many other countries' elections. But most notably, there was sort of meddling in a third country, the United States in particular, that it actually did lead to probably more of an outcome that Putin probably wanted, and how it got a certain type of leader that was more vocally supportive of Putin. How does that play in the in this particular 4 years?
Try and attack this, and then of course go to the panelists. So Putin has a certain strategy But I would disagree with you saying that there was more of an enhancement that Russia was able to put a certain person who was more favorable in power in the United States. I think there was an element that Russia played. And if you read had submitted when it came to Russian meddling into US elections, the objective of Russia was to discredit democracy in the United States and not necessarily go towards one candidate or the other. And that was a conclusion from that analysis. So the way I'm going to address your question has to do with strategy and has to do with psychological operations, as well as providing narrative and propaganda. So the way Russia looks at things is that they have a campaign, and it's called, basically what objective they want to do. And if that has to do with looking at the United States and bringing discredit to democracy, that hacking or that meddling in elections is an action that will contribute to that strategy overall. Now, if you're looking at a larger Russian objective of, I'm just going to throw that out there, but Russia reemerging as a greater power than normally seen, them meddling in other countries' elections, it will contribute, that action will contribute to their overall to enforce that strategy and what they want to achieve as their objective.
So,
I think we want to give some other questions a chance, but we can talk to you after the panel, maybe a little bit.
okay.
Let's have one more from the in-person group, and then I've got one here from online, but go ahead.
Well, my question I have actually asked a couple days ago to our Polish guest. My name is Dennis Saviv, and of course I have been particular in regards to Russian disinformation, and I've been openly involved in keeping an eye on this conflict myself. I have a friend in Ukraine who's in Kiev, and I've actually been wanting to even go to Ukraine to help in any way I can. Unfortunately, I can't due to the academic circumstances here. But of course, my question is in pertaining to Russian disinformation here, and just even globally. We have seen countless, European politicians in particular, especially in Germany, who are in power, who have, claimed that we want to stop Russian influence in any way, shape, or form, even if that means in an economical sense of, stop the influence of Russian oil coming into Germany. But there's still a couple of German politicians who will take Russian oil whenever. But of course, we've been seeing here in the United States countless Americans who will fall into Russian disinformation. And I've even watched some of Russian state media, of course, laughable in the sense of how they've taken this whole conflict. But the biggest question is, how can we as Americans, or just in our communities, or even around the globe, even in European countries, deal with Russian misinformation in regards to this conflict?
So just in case anybody on Zoom can't hear, the question was about how can we counter Russian disinformation and sort of, curtail some of this possibility for conflict.
Yeah, I try to tell something more. Disinformation, this term, was born in Russia in the late 19th. For Russia. Doesn't mean that disinformation is some kind of part of strategical culture of Russia. And they were playing this during this Russian Imperium, during the Soviet Union, and now. Of course, they changing only the tools. Now they have internet, they have Russia Today, etc. But it's very important for us that we're talking about Russia for many years. First time when my colleague was here in 2019 on the conference, we were talking in fact about Russia. In 2021, we were talking about Russia. Now, I'm talking about Russia in Europe as well for many years. And what we heard from our European friends, no, Russia is good, Tchaikovsky is good, Moscow beautiful. you probably Poles have some medical problems with Russia. Of course, we have medical problem with Russia because there is 700 years war with Russia still. We have only some pause for 20, 40 years war with Russia. Generally, this is our kind of our sport, war with Russia. And when we are talking to the West, you have to see how Russia is really looks like. They say, no, Voltaire said that Russia is beautiful. No, but Rousseau said something different. Edward Said was a book, Orientalism. This was about Muslims and Near East. But what is important? Orientalism is something that you think that you understand. And unfortunately, French, Germans, and even US thinks that they understand Russian. It's part of Europe, it's funny, was called as La Orientale Europea. That means Orient of Europe. That's why I'm using this side conception of Orientalism to make you understand why you do not understand Russian. Because you think that you understand it, but it's working in this is a different civilization than the West. And sometimes we are using this that I think that he's thinking the same way as the Russian is thinking completely different. And when we are talking about this in Europe and the US, honestly, it wasn't such a big problem. I think that maybe because you are far away from Russia, you see better. French or Germans don't see. Now they discovered that is for equipment for Russian army. They haven't seen this before. Yes, it was better to talk something different. And we were talking about this information. Now we are very glad, we are very happy that people on the West now can see what this real Russia looks like. And this information is not working. This war collapsed in many myths. One of the myths was that Russia is very good in information warfare. Please look, who is believe now Russia's information? Nobody. They are trying to tell something that is impossible to understand. For example, I was saying about Bucha. Do you know what's the Russian version? What was prepared by NATO, and even named this city was chosen because Bucha sounds like butcher. No, it'd be easier to pronounce this for people from the West. That's why NATO with Ukrainians killed people in Bucha, not in Izium or another difficult to pronounce city. Oh.
So the cover story from the Russian narrative was that this was a NATO attack done to okay,
because they have white stripes. That means that they were Russians people, and Ukrainians went to the Bucha because the name. They are killing these people, and now it is impossible to talk with Ukrainians peace talks because Ukrainians made such massacre. It's ridiculous, yes, for us. But probably a few years ago, this story we will find some people in the West. Yes, it's probably it's true. The Ukrainians are bad people, Poles are the same. Russians are good. Probably there is some truth. Now, I think nobody is disinformation of Russia. But of course, this is very big problem. For example, the case of Cambridge Analytica. We know the Russians support this. I don't want to talk about the US election, but we believe that Russia was supporting Trump very strongly, especially by this Yevgeny Prigozhin farmers of trolls. In our opinion, there was very strong help from Russia. Maybe there was some problems with financials of Trump. There are some links with oligarchs from Russia. Timothy Snyder has some book about this. It was published in the US. There's a lot, something wrong with the connection between Trump and Russia, but I'm not sure. It's something that I'm not able to tell that election in the US was healthy, but we see that this information now is not so strong like we used to, because the world saw the facts. Now, for example, Ukrainian warfare information, in my opinion, is very good. That's what they're showing. Please show what they are doing here. This is a very good job that they are doing. That's why we are here talking about it. Because you do not believe to put in this what Ukrainian shows and another person who are there. For example, CNN here. For us, it's very big.
Question from an online participant, and it could relate to this issue we were just discussing, so I'll put it out here. The participant asks, since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been reported strikes on Russian soil. The government of Ukraine has never, to this person's knowledge, claimed direct responsibility for this. What is the purpose of this strategy, and why would they not claim responsibility, as it could act as a motivating factor for the Ukrainians? So does anybody have any thoughts on that? As far as I recall myself, that Russian ship went down, but no one exactly said what happened. The Russians had their story, but I don't think the Ukrainians said we did it. So does anybody know what's going on there? You're not authorized to say?
Maybe it's kind of message from NATO, because or that Turkish drone play a crucial role. We know that American plane Poseidon was something was there over the sea, and we know that this ship was not very advanced, but it's for me it's a striking fact that radar system and electronic warfare system of this ship was completely blind and deaf. And maybe it's kind of fighting means of American plane, and it could be perceived as a message to Russian leaders, because this ship was a symbol, and we used to the situation that Russians making threats toward us, and maybe it's time for making threats to Russia, maybe not in a direct way, but in a way that passes resolution of United Nations about humanitarian aid, and of course, humanitarian aid is crucial. But the only language that Russians understand the violence.
Yes, it is true. Please see on the Turkey and Russian relation. When Turkey shut down Russian aircraft in Syria, Putin said, "Oh, the Putin is my friend," no? Because he speaks the same language like me. And now, this story with this ship Moscow is strange. Probably Ukrainians get them, but without West intelligence, I think it was possible. But on the worst, some things you are doing, I'm talking about this, and I think that this is this case. Sometimes it's better to not say at all. Sometimes you have to be quiet. Honestly, I know Ukrainian army quite well. In my opinion, without support from US, Great Britain, will be in 2-3 weeks. You see, first 2-3 days, Russian bombing, nothing. They are putting bombs. There was now Ukrainian soldiers, spaces, tanks. How it's happening? Of course, Ukraine have the good intelligence. I think that not so good, but we don't know. It's
Yeah, so when it comes to looking at this from like a game theory standpoint, is it easier to look at this as more of a finite game where we will see winners and losers, or with Russia's involvement since 2014 and then even like tensions from Cold War era, is it easier to look at this as a finite game where we're waiting for or analyzing if people run out of resources before there'll be actual winners and losers?
Just to reiterate the question, you're asking if, is it in sort of a game theory analysis, is it better to? Finite game versus infinite game. You want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at an infinite game because because you could backpedal to Crimea. I mean, we're still continuing the same game. There's, who was the losers during that? So you're looking at those actors that were losers in that sense, but the game hasn't stopped. Okay, so that's just a quick answer to something where we're looking at how we're continuing the same, but then there are other dynamics that are becoming involved that didn't happen during Crimea as well. So it's there's going to be a lot of additions, I think, in addition to what we're going to see now.
Well, we do know that the panel is finite. And it's reached the end of its allotted time, although we could talk a lot longer about this and learn a lot more, although we've learned a great deal already. So we'll wrap it up for now, but let's thank our panelists.